Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 26th week of 2018. I'm Carl Estabrook. For almost 30 years, this program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of this program are available at archive.org. Our program's name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky, who's been writing sensible things about U.S. politics for twice as long as we've been on the air. Chomsky says that in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Tonight, David Green and I will try to say some true things with thanks to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, for research. No's notes are posted on the News from Neptune Facebook page. We try to bear in mind the murdered Rosa Luxemburg's remark from a century ago. The most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. This is a homelessness edition of News from Neptune, with asylum seekers on the U.S. border being treated very badly, and refugees in Europe being treated very badly. We should realize the extent to which both these tragedies are the result of U.S. government policies. And what of homelessness in U.S. cities? Jeffrey Sinclair of Counterpunch points out that 1 in every 2 arrests made by Portland police last year was of a homeless person. Warm cities tend to attract folks who have not been able to find a way into the housing system we have in this country for obvious reasons. Portland is not that warm a city, but in comparison, in some ways it is. But these individuals and families are also attracted to some cities with somewhat rougher winters because they have more reasonable policies about what people living rough, as our British friends would say, need. I've been struck during this time in the Seattle area. The author of this is a housing specialist who has been living in Seattle recently, by the number of small tent cities and the trees of public rights of way all around the city. And Boston has a sizable homeless population, I think because it is the only right to housing state. That's an almost meaningless statement for the population we're talking about here. There is more to this problem that needs to be examined. But where these folks are located also depends a lot on where they were last living in a home. People who are homeless generally don't have the money or other resources they need to study the situation in cities across the country and then pick out one where they think it would be easiest for them. The homeless individuals and families that we see in the streets or in shelters are actually people with 3 different sets of problems. First are the temporarily homeless. These are people who've been put into this situation because of some unusual circumstance. A woman and her kids are escaping from an abusive relationship with her partner. A fire has destroyed a family's home, and they have no relatives or friends they can turn to. A gay child has been kicked out of his home by her or his parents. These people need a temporary solution, typically a shelter, though I would like to see us develop more pleasant solutions for this group. Once they get themselves together, they're likely to be able to find their way back into the housing market and not return to this condition in the future. A second group is chronically homeless. They have a set of behaviors that make it impossible for them to maintain a rented home for too long. They have a substance abuse dependency of some kind, or they have anger issues that cause problems with neighbors, or they do not have the workplace skills to hold down jobs for a long period of time that pay enough to afford housing. Folks like this often find a rental arrangement for a while, but then something goes wrong and they lose their home. They go to a shelter, or they double up with a friend for a while, get themselves back on track, find another rental, but then 6 months later it goes bad again. This group of people needs a permanent, staffed, services-rich housing resource that we've never built in this country. It's not a hard problem to solve conceptually. It just takes a little money and some political will. If you have not read the excellent book by Matthew Desmond called Evicted, I recommend it highly. It will give you a good idea of this group of people, an amazing account of a good number of our fellow citizens. The third group of homeless folks are those with significant mental illness. Literally on the coldest night of the year, when Boston officials cruise the streets looking for people who have no place to sleep, these people will not go with them. They believe the shelters are actually places where they will be tortured and killed, or transported to Siberia, or poisoned with uranium in their meals, or pick your story. This is the hardest group to serve, but I firmly believe that if we just, in the words of Jim Rouse, the thoughtful developer of Columbia, Maryland, intended to solve the problem, we could do it. So the short answer to the question is that permanent housing of some kind is exactly the solution to the condition of homelessness that many of our neighbors suffer from. Of course, if we got the profit motive out of the rental housing industry to begin with, that would reduce the number of people who would experience this crisis. But even if we let the robber barons continue to run parts of the apartment business, we could pretty easily solve this issue with a little resolve. Some problems can, in fact, be solved by throwing money at them. This statement, as I say, by an expert on the issues of housing in this country, in fact comes from my brother-in-law, who I've known since the 4th grade, who is the ex-curator of the Loeb Fellows Program at Harvard, the Graduate School of Design. And it's the result of a lifetime, really, spent on this problem. You notice the similarities with the problem and its solution to the problem of single-payer health care. These are things that government should be doing for their citizens, and we're clearly not. Instead, we're killing people in the Mideast, and this has got to change. You're listening to News from Neptune, a homelessness edition, and we'll go to David Green.
Yeah, just to respond a little bit to add on to what you just said, you have these three areas of life which shouldn't be for profit, but which are, one of which, of course, is housing and healthcare, as you mentioned, and education is the third one.
Right.
And sort of the classic, so we have these stereotypes that evolve. The student debt crisis ends up with 20-something or 30-something people living in their parents' basements, and then if not homeless. And then you have the homelessness crisis, which tends to be more associated with mental illness and drugs, but not necessarily so, of course. There was a foreclosure crisis from 2008 and 9 that went along with that, which I'm sure contributed to the homeless crisis. And then there's, of course, the healthcare crisis, and part of which is the medical debt crisis, which can certainly contribute to homelessness also. So these things are all related, and as people like Walter Ben Michaels and others article this kind of tripartite argument of things that need to be decommodified, meaning not for profit, meaning funded by government, meaning not just the sort of catchword affordable, but free. When they say affordable housing, it isn't that people shouldn't pay for housing. It's that housing should be adjusted to what their incomes are, or there should be public housing. So a couple of things that your comments also brought to mind recently. One of those cities, Seattle, had passed a law which was a head tax, $250 for the Amazon.com and other employers that have made Seattle, on the one hand, a rich city, but on the other hand, of course, a city in which housing is increasingly not affordable by people by working class people of relatively modest means. Not even modest means, but just when rents go up that way, you can't afford, you have to keep moving farther and farther out. So this $250 head tax, which was of course passed against the wishes of Jeff Bezos, was recently overturned by the Seattle City Council, famous for its one socialist member, Shama Sawant, who was of course in favor and behind this head tax and the subsequent conflicts that went along with that. The Seattle City Council sort of being bought to rescind this this head tax. So the homeless problem remains what it is, how much a dent that might have made, but it would have provided some money for quote-unquote affordable housing. Another reference in relation to what you were talking about, in the current Harper's magazine, July issue, a long article, but an excellent article called "The Death of a Once Great City," speaking of New York City, by Kevin Baker. All the aspects of what we're talking about here, and especially focusing on the idea that a rich city like New York, especially New York, but other cities as well, but classically New York is where rich people around the world park their money by buying houses, by buying residences in which they don't live, changing the character of these neighborhoods with these towers. And it was really, this article is really a tour de force by this fellow Kevin Baker, who's lived on the Upper West Side for the last 40 years and seen all these changes in Manhattan at large and in his neighborhood, the Upper West Side. He talks about not only about the wealth, the affluence. He talks about the Bloomberg, about these massive housing projects for the wealthy in Long Island City and a place called Hudson's. I think it's called Hudson's Point, and just fascinating. Very much brings to mind, if you've ever read it, the Jane Jacobs work on Boston from the 1960s.
Right.
The Jane Jacobs, the great urban anthropologist. So let's stay in New York City. Let's stay in another, what sounds like the more sort of pleasant and richly diverse urban boroughs of New York City, which would be Queens. And the recent election, the recent primary election contest, in which a young woman, a 28-year-old woman of partly Puerto Rican background named Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, defeated the person who might have been succeeded Nancy Pelosi as the Democratic leader of the House, and perhaps even Speaker of the House, or at least leader of the Democratic House caucus. And she handily defeated this fellow Joe Crowley, this corrupt Joe Crowley, by something like 57% of the vote. And in a primary in which not that many people vote, and in which the Democratic Party's way of limiting the vote actually was used against him, against the machine Democratic Party, and this woman, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, subscribes to basically a Green Party or Democratic Socialist of America platform, which I'll get back to in a moment. Let me just read a little blurb from the Washington Post. While Ocasio poses a strong challenge to mainstream Democrats, she also might threaten the local Latino Puerto Rican political establishment that has never veered too far away from the Democratic center. Bronx Borough President Ruben Diaz lamented Crowley's loss, calling him someone from the community needed in Washington. And up to now, there's been no reaction from the longtime borough. I'm not sure what this word is. Borough rep. This woman, other rep, Nydia M. Velasquez, Jose Serrano, both members of Congress from New York, or the more well-known around here, Louis V. Gutierrez, the latter of whom campaigned for Crowley.
Right.
Okay, so the local state hero of the Latino population, the Latinx population, the Chicago Puerto Rican hero, campaigned for the corrupt establishment Crowley against the up-and-coming person of partly Puerto Rican background. Democratic Party politics, here we go. Just so happened, Amy Goodwin was down at the border covering the refugee crisis this morning, and I happened to come across a comment that she was interviewing Tom Perez, obviously another person of Latinx background, who heads the corrupt DCC in Washington, trying to keep these Bernie-crats and these DSA people from getting a little bit of a foothold. And he basically lied to her when she asked him about his and their support for Crowley. He claimed, no, they were neutral in that context. But let me put one fly in the ointment here. You look at Ocasio-Cortez's platform, and it's a great DSA-type Green Party platform, including dealing with the decommodification of those aspects of life that are part of this list. And you look, of course, all the way down on this list of 10, and you get to the 10th one, which has to do with foreign policy. And again, not surprising, but just worth noting. The statement here is the following: we support an economy of peace that supports our veterans and actively values all humanity. Okay, a somewhat tepid and perhaps anti-war message, but not the anti-war message I would like to hear from the Bernie-crat or DSA wing of the Democratic Party, as much as satisfying as it is to see somebody like Joe Crowley defeated by her.
Good.
And I will recommend one more thing along these lines, and that is an article on Counterpunch this morning, or an interview actually, by a woman named Laura Wells, who's challenging the Bay Area Democrat of a much more reputable nature, Barbara Lee. But it's interesting that Laura Wells, this Green Party DSA type person, Peace and Freedom Party is what they have in California also, she is challenging in this two candidate system that is not a good system, but she's again turning it to the advantage of herself as a third party candidate. So I recommend that interview that she did. It's under the title of Ann Garrison, or under the author Ann Garrison, interviewing Laura Wells on this morning's Counterpunch.
This raises the question, David, of what insurgent Democrats, basically Bernie Democrats, really are doing within the Democratic Party, and the terrible tergiversation of the Bernie campaign from the beginning. It's defined or described in detail, and Jeffrey Sinclair's book on the Democratic Party and the Bernie movement. This is an issue, a fairly important issue going on here within the Democratic Party, where the insurgents who are attempting to do away with the warfare party that has existed for a while is ducking on foreign policy. It seemed to be the case also for Ocasio-Cortez campaign in New York, although I think the jury's out. I think it's an indication of where the real debate within the party is going, and not surprisingly, it's about the war-making of the Democratic Party that was so prominent in the last presidential administration, even though Obama went out of his way to obfuscate it, to hide it. Here's what happened in New York. Eric Karras writes, "I was happy to see an anti-war Democrat beat the establishment member, Joe Crowley, in New York. I'd read the following on Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez website 6 weeks ago." This is what her website said more than a month ago. Quote, "Foreign policy. Since the invasion of Iraq in 2003, the United States has entangled itself in war and occupation throughout the Middle East and North Africa. As of 2018, we are currently involved in military action in Libya, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Pakistan, and Somalia. According to the Constitution, the right to declare war belongs to the legislative body, not to the president. It belongs to Congress, not to the president. Yet most of these acts of aggression have never once been voted on by Congress. Alex, that is Ocasio-Cortez, believes that we must end the forever war by bringing our troops home and ending the airstrikes and bombings that perpetuate the cycle of terrorism and occupation throughout the world. That, as I say, was the statement on the website during the campaign. However, a month later, the foreign policy section has been deleted and is still gone today. I assume that someone in the campaign thought she needed to avoid such a controversial stance against war and standing up for the constitutional position that, quote, the right to declare war belongs to the legislative body, not the president, close quote. What a shame. I hope that she doesn't shy away from the strong anti-war position she first campaigned on when she takes office. Now, in response to this comment, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sent this note as a tweet. That's the way we do it these days. I was overjoyed to see this, first of all, a comment from her campaign. I was overjoyed to see Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez defeat a corporate Democrat, but it was disappointing to learn that her uncontroversial, I've said this wrong each time, this was the objection. I was overjoyed to see the defeat of Joe Crowley, but it was disappointing to learn that Ocasio's controversial anti-war stance on U.S. foreign policy was removed from her website. To which Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez answers, hey, looking into this, nothing malicious. Cite a supporter run, so things happen. We'll get to the bottom of it. Now, that's not quite a reassertion of the foreign policy statement, but it's pretty close to it. Yeah. And so I think what we see here is the very real debate going on within the Democratic Party, and a good reason in many cases not to vote for Democrats on the grounds that they are anti-war figures. I will hope that Ocasio-Cortez clarifies her position soon. But I would like to turn to a horrible local example of this particular matter, and that's our senior senator, Dick Durbin. Dick Durbin has organized, I think, but signed with about a dozen other Democrats, a letter to Vice President Pence, who is off to Ecuador to get the new Ecuadorian government in line. And our senior senator, this shining liberal, tells Pence that one thing he's got to do is get Ecuador to stop providing sanctuary to Julian Assange, the head of WikiLeaks. This is outrageous. I mean, we knew Durbin's foreign policy views were wretched to begin with, but for him specifically to call now on the Ecuadorian government to throw Julian Assange, the head of WikiLeaks, to the tender mercies of what eventually will be the American government, is outrageous. And it seems to me that if we're looking at the possibility of decent Democrats saying things about war, we'll not look at Dick Durbin very much.
No. Just two footnotes to that would be, I think Ocasio-Cortez has also made some very strong statements about Palestine. And they're out there to be found somewhere, whether they're on her website or
no, that's very
I
true.
don't know. I think they were mainly just a quoted statement that she made at some either written or perhaps spoken. And what's interesting about that is that in 2018, when you're running for Congress in the Democratic primary in a district that is partly the Bronx and partly Queens, and mostly minority or mostly Latino or black, you can say stuff like that. But interestingly, I think you could probably also say it in districts that were mostly Brooklyn also. That's how much of the kind of tenor of the debate about Israel-Palestine. Certainly you could. There's parts of Brooklyn. I'm not sure how that's mapped out, but certainly that's something you can say. And also Durbin, just to tie that up a little bit, we must remind ourselves that allegedly, perhaps I haven't done enough research into this, but allegedly, Dick Durbin's first run for Congress against a fellow named Paul Findley in this neck of the woods not exactly this way, around here somewhere, maybe over in Springfield, was partly in opposition to Finley's opposition or Finley's criticism, who's his very lonely and solitary criticism as a member of Congress of Israel's policies. This would have been back in, I think, the 1980s. That's how Dick Durbin got his start in national politics, and certainly nothing he's done since then has shown that he's at all off board when it comes to supporting Israel and everything Israel does. So that just adds to the comments that you're making in regards to his views on foreign policy.
Well, there's another matter of this, too, in that the letter to Pence, which was published, obviously, and signed by these dozen Democrats with Dick Durbin at their head, is a complete reassertion of the Russiagate nonsense, too. The reason that Durbin and the others allege that the asylum for Assange by Ecuador must be ended was that WikiLeaks was responsible for the meddling in the American presidential election sponsored by Russia. Now, this is not an isolated matter, particularly since we've just heard the announcement that there will be a meeting between Trump and Putin on the 16th of next month. This is an attempt by the Russiagate enthusiasts, which are primarily the political establishment made up of the Democratic Party, the Clinton leftovers of the Clinton campaign, the intelligence communities, the neocons and others, to wreck the attempts by the Trump administration that are represented by the summit in Singapore, and the summit will be in Helsinki, I think, with President Putin. These are not, as it were, isolated matters and simple mistakes. These are major foreign policy decisions carried out by the Democratic Party, and the real reason that I think in the fall election the Democrats should not be given control of Congress. We've talked about this before in terms of the local election. We have, after all, only one federal vote between now and the 2018 November 2018 election, and that's for Congress this fall in this area. And I've been saying that, in fact, the feckless Republican incumbent should be voted for in our fall election, rather than the conventional Democrat who's challenging him. A lot of commentators on this program, have found that bizarre. But it seems to me that when we look at what Durbin is saying and what Durbin is doing, and I will put the entire letter of Dick Durbin on the Facebook page so you can read it for yourself, when we see what the Democrats are in fact doing in foreign policy and the way they're trying to maintain the war provocations against Russia that was the stealth policy of the last administration, they can't be given control of Congress. You've got to vote against him, and that means, remarkably enough, voting for the wretched Rodney Davis here in Illinois 13th Congressional District.
Anyway,
David, I know you don't quite agree with this, but I mean, it's
but I don't disagree with it either.
Yeah,
I mean, it's just it's a kind of a Hobson's choice, I guess, is what they call it. Whoever the hell Hobson was, didn't he play third base for the Boston Red Sox? But anyway,
he played music in the Cranner. Yeah.
Okay, right, that Hobson, yeah. The New York Times editorial board editorial this morning about the Trump-Putin meeting, among other things, complains about the fact that Trump and Putin had a conversation with each other without other people around. No, seriously, it's like you can't do that. Yeah. You can't just go talk to one leader. I mean, Trump's awful. Trump's horrible, of course. But the thing is, this doesn't have anything to do with why the New York Times is criticizing him. They're criticizing him because Trump, for whatever reason, doesn't much like NATO. and you've got to love NATO if you're running the world properly from Washington. You've got to love NATO, and Trump just isn't with the program when it comes to that sort of thing.
I think there's actually a larger issue here.
Sure.
I mean, I agree with you entirely on that point, but what the American political establishment is doing depends upon the hidden policy of that establishment, hidden from the American people. According to the American people, the American political establishment is simply spreading democratic values around the world, peace and freedom, and helping people, and fighting the forces of evil that turn up, remarkably enough, every place from Asia to Latin America. Now, this, of course, is propaganda and nonsense. What the U.S. is doing and has been doing since the Second World War is trying to maintain the economic dominance and exploitation of the rest of the world that it found itself in possession of at the end of the Second World War. And that all the wars, the millions, literally millions of people killed by the United States in wars since World War II have been in aid of maintaining this economic hegemony around the world. Now, think about what happened here and prescind from the psychologizing of Donald Trump for a minute. Think about what happened here in the 2016 election. Donald Trump was the first major party candidate in 40 years to attack the policies of neoliberalism and neoconservatism. Those are the policies that lead to more war and more inequality, which has grown rapidly and at an increasing rate over that 40 years. Trump actually attack those policies, and if we don't understand that that was the reason he was elected, we're really not understanding what's happened in recent American political history. Americans who felt themselves aggrieved by the economic policies of the previous administration, and whose sons and daughters in some cases were coming home in boxes from foreign wars, they stayed home or voted for Trump. Voters who had put Obama in office didn't put Clinton in office because of the failure of the policies from their point of view of the Obama administration, which Clinton clearly meant to continue. Now, until we understand that that was what was going on in American politics, we have some trouble understanding why it should be the case that the American political establishment is moving heaven and earth to make sure that Trump continues those policies of foreign war and foreign war provocation against our peer competitors, as the foreign policy establishment calls it, that is Russia and China. That's the real fight that's going on. They cover sin with smooth names here when they worry about whether Trump is abandoning the wonderful policies of peace and freedom that have produced wonderful policies that have produced peace and freedom for those 40 years. But most Americans understood that Trump was speaking for them over against the establishment, political and economic, and for all of Trump's vagaries, they elected him. Now, that battle goes on, that continues. What we've seen, unfortunately, is the Trump administration willing to adopt those policies, the policies of the Obama administration, both on foreign policy and economic policy, everything from support for Israel to the economic machinations that Trumpism has meant in conjunction with the Republican Party. But the hope is still there, remarkably enough, amongst Americans that they voted for an opposition to it.
It's more important to say, as you rightly point out, that that's why he got elected president.
Yes.
The question is, and I know we don't like to get into motives and this and that about Donald Trump, but the point is that the question is whether he was just playing the population for rubes by saying these things because he has a decent political instinct about such things, and whether what he's doing in office is actually a sincere, no less coherent effort to actually bring about some of these policies in relation to Korea. Okay, he's made at least a step forward in his strange way. It's hard to believe, given the tax cut, which is the most obvious example of the fact that he, as much as Obama or anyone else, is serving the interests of the 1%. So I don't think we can place a lot of faith in Donald Trump actually having a program that makes life better for the people who allegedly voted for him for these reasons.
I'm less interested in that than I am in the sorts of views of the American electorate and why they elected him and why they want to see the policies that they heard about from him and that they want instituted to continue. What we're dealing with here, David, as we've talked about here before on this program, has listed little, if anything, to do with Trump's motives, and a great deal to do with the populist mood that's not limited to the United States. The Trump campaign and the Sanders campaign, which are much more alike than the partisans of either side want to say, the Trump campaign and the Sanders campaign grew out of this populist mood, as did the Brexit vote in England, as did the Le Pen vote in France, as did the votes even for AKD in Germany, AFD in Germany. The populism as a general term for the realization that the society is being run for the purposes of a relatively small elite and an objection to those policies on that ground. That's the shape of politics in the world today. And the fact of the matter is that after a long Cold War generation in which Americans and others were told that the real issue was left versus right, and you surely had to be on the side of peace and freedom and over against those evil political bosses who control Russia and China and want to gather up the rest of the world, until we realize that the propaganda that has supported American hegemony for 2 generations now is coming apart, and that the fraying at the edges is the sort of thing we're seeing, as say, in the Trump campaign and the populist move in Europe and elsewhere, up to and including the recent Italian government. That's what's going on, and our political masters, our political leaders, our political rulers understand that. They see that's what's happening, and they're scared to death. They're working very hard to make sure that Trump gets with the program. They're working very hard to make sure that this government continues to do the things that previous government, this administration, continues to do the things that previous administrations have done, and don't take up any of that dangerous talk that was going on in the campaign.
That's all well and good. I agree with you, but it's worth pointing out that Trump's background is the same background that transformed New York City. Again, the title of this article in Harper's, "The Death of a Once Great City, the Fall of New York and Its Urban Crisis of Affluence." That's Donald Trump. That's Trump Tower. That's the mentality, the real estate mentality, the fire of finance, insurance, real estate mentality that's transformed the major cities of this country and transformed, of course, the sort of the industrial hinterlands of this country in the last 40 years. It's hard to have any faith in Trump's awareness or ability to seriously challenge what these long-term institutional structural trends have been. But again, it's worth pointing out that people were certainly voting against Hillary Clinton and her participation, as well as Trump, in these processes for the past 40 years.
But the political establishment wants to make sure that everyone believes that people who are voting against Hillary Clinton were voting against her because these people are misogynists or because they don't like black people or some other. What they don't want to do is talk about the real reason that the swing voters didn't vote for Hillary, and those reasons are economic and military, and that's where the political establishment doesn't want the discussion to go.
Yeah.
We've got to talk about race. We've got to talk about sex.
Yeah.
We can't talk about the people we're killing around the world, and we can't talk about the massive and increasing inequality in America. That's the real task, and that's what the Democrats are working very hard to do. And when they have outbreaks like the election of Ocasio-Cortez, they're scared to death.
Yeah.
They are absolutely scared to death.
And of course, all the talk is about, well, what's going to happen? How is the DCCC, the National Democratic, people who usually get to decide who runs in these primaries, who wins these primaries, what are they going to be doing? Are they going to be gently trying to sort of co-opt her? Are they going to be threatening her? Are they going to be, exactly how? And this is what Tom Perez, began the process when he was interviewed by Amy Goodman this morning, of sort of pretending that, well, she's one of us.
Right.
That's not all there is to it.
Right.
And let's beat up on Democrats in one more way here.
There's plenty of opportunity. It's a target-rich environment.
Yeah, this isn't about the Republicans are, of course, just as are worse in most ways. It's just that Trump has thrown this little crick into this process here. But a kind of an interesting interview on the Real News Network by their correspondent Greg Wilpert about the refugee crisis and the children being ripped away from their parents' crisis. A very pointed interview with a fellow who has a lot of credibility to say so. A fellow you've never heard of, named Roberto Lovato, who is of Salvadoran background and who works out of San Francisco. And this 10 or 12 minute interview was all about the fact that the current crisis, as much as I support, I was out there last Saturday. It was a good event. It was a good rally. It was very well done.
Demonstration against ICE. You're talking about
out by Drury Inn and on North Prospect there, attended by I guess a couple hundred people, and felt like I was almost having too good of a time, just rallying and talking to people and so forth. But anyway, what this fellow Roberto Lovato says is, to quote, the transcript wasn't up there yet this morning, and I didn't want to go back and listen to the whole thing and transcribe it. But what the heading for the interview is: the outrage at Trump's immigration policies, the Muslim travel ban, family separations, indefinite incarceration, zero tolerance, and now possibly no due process for immigrants is justified, but forgets the outrage is justified, but forgets all too easily Obama's and the Democrats' own horrific immigration policies. That was the tone of what this interview was, and he really didn't hold any quarter for favorably comparing Obama's policies at all for what's happening. And he quite pointedly saw this, for better or worse, as a Democratic Party kind of media campaign. And I raised this issue last week, and I was trying to decide whether to go to this rally last Saturday because I didn't want it to be another Democratic Party function, and I don't think it was. In fact, it wasn't. And the reason that I know it wasn't a Democratic Party function is that some of the local, more Democratic-oriented groups actually backed out of supporting that rally, and they're having their own rally, tomorrow, meeting at the Champaign Public Library and walking around that neighborhood there, because these groups, and I have to say, the Bend the Arc, the self-described Jewish progressive groups that don't want to get mixed up with groups because they don't want to get mixed up with any issues that really have to do with foreign policy, broadly speaking, especially Israel-Palestine. It all falls into place. The groups that really didn't want to sponsor and support and appear last Saturday when it was a nice day, about 70 degrees out there, they're going to be marching around in 95-degree weather out there. Good for them. I'm not saying I oppose them doing that. I'm just trying to express, even at this local level, how clearly these fault lines, these intra-Democratic Party or the genuine critics versus the machine people, how that lays out.
I thought for a while that one of the best poets of the 20th century, was actually quite wrong when he wrote in a wonderful play, really, the last temptation is the greatest treason, to do the right deed for the wrong reason. I think at least when we talk about politics, that may be true in some sense on the moral level for the individual, but for politics, it's not true at all. Do the right deed, even if it's for the wrong reason. And we're talking about the ACLU as well as Donald Trump here. We're talking about the pro-Israel, Peppers, progressive except for Palestine people. All we want. Do the right deed, even if it's for the wrong reason. Go ahead. Don't let T.S. Eliot stop you.
Well, you know, there really wasn't room for them last Saturday anyway. I mean, the sidewalks were all filled up.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And, you know, it was good enough that we could get across, you know, the street without disrupting traffic too much, although that wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. But anyway, a good time was had by all. Unfortunately, not by the people that were rallying, you know, in favor of. But don't be, you know, we look at this interview with this fellow Roberto Lovato, and again, the credibility comes from his background and from his experience with this issue, giving absolutely no quarter to anything, to the idea that the Trump people are doing anything much worse than what Obama was doing or Bush before that.
But whatever it is, whatever its source, it should be stopped. And indeed, a federal judge has now said that, and the federal government has a responsibility to stop it. But we can't stop the agitation about the matter from there. We have to go much further in the direction of open borders and the acceptance of immigration to the U.S., specifically of people, or particularly of people whose need to immigrate has been a result of American military and economic policy. The American military coups throughout the U.S. military coups throughout Central America, the U.S. Economic imperialism such as NAFTA, these are the source of the refugee crisis, the reason people are at the border to begin with, and the U.S. has a responsibility to not only to admit these people, of course that it has that responsibility, but also to do something for them because it's caused the economic and social distress. Social distress is a thin word for being having your life and your family threatened by coosters in Honduras. It's the U.S. government that's responsible for this, and the U.S. government that has to take responsibility. And I really don't care what Donald Trump thinks. The U.S. government has got to do this.
And it's important to note that the refugees are coming from the so-called Northern Triangle of Central America, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, which have been most negatively impacted by these, at least successfully negative, quote unquote, successfully negatively impacted by historic U.S. foreign policies. Meanwhile, the other country which we tried to, whose government which we actually did overthrow back in the 1980s, Nicaragua, is also undergoing an effort at a kind of soft coup, kind of complicated, a little controversial in some ways in terms of who's supporting this, but. I've come down on the side from what I know about it. Maybe you have a different view of this. That this is basically parallel to the sort of color revolutions that we have supported in Eastern Europe and so forth. That is the protests against Daniel Ortega's government in Nicaragua, which is itself a neoliberal government. People understand that. But even some of the people that tend to, that in this complicated way have tended to be critical of the left for its lack of opposition to Assad in Syria and so forth, like our friend Louis Proyect, has taken a more balanced view of what the nature of these demonstrations and protests against Ortega are at the current time, and how that's playing out, and how the U.S. is mixed up with that in its nefarious way.
The beginning of wisdom here is to recognize the responsibility of the United States not only for the refugee crisis in Europe, which is barely mentioned, that is U.S.
Sure.
responsibility, but also for the horrors that are occurring on the U.S. southern border right now as a result of both the causal activity of the U.S. government and its failure to deal with the just demands of the refugees on the border.
And in that line, let me mention that Medea Benjamin is going to be speaking tomorrow, in case you happen to be watching this before tomorrow, at the McKinley Presbyterian Church at 5th and Daniel in Champaign at 1:30. And her talk is going to have to do with mostly Middle Eastern issues. She's been very involved with Yemen and Palestine, and
Particularly Iran.
and and she'll be speaking and selling books tomorrow there.
And that's tomorrow, Saturday,
That's
the 30th.
Code Pink is the group that she was.
Saturday, the 30th of June at 1:30. Is that right, David?
1:30.
At 5th and Daniel Street in downtown Champaign. You're watching News from Neptune. I want to mention one other story that we have a detailed account of from Dr. No, which will be on the Facebook page for News from Neptune. That's the case of Reality Winner, who has a 26-year-old Air Force veteran and former NSA contractor who leaked a sensitive document. It was a document, in fact, about Russian meddling in American elections.
The word sensitive means truthful.
Yeah, well, it's not even true about the document. Was a report on that talked about Russian cyber spying in the U.S. She leaked it to The Intercept. The Intercept immediately went to the government and said, hey, is this true? But they provided the document that she provided, which identified her, not obviously, but electronically in the document. And the government arrested her for leaking the document and has now sentenced her to 5 years in jail for leaking the document in the first place. Now, you can talk about the criminal obtuseness of The Intercept in burning their source as they did. It's not entirely clear that they meant to, whether it was just stupid or really, in fact, in some way malicious regard to their source. That's not clear at all. But what's much more important here is the action of the government. This is action under the Espionage Act, which was passed by the Wilson administration at the time of the First World War in order to prevent people from criticizing American government policy, the Wilson administration's policy to get an anti-war country, which is what the U.S. was in 1917, into the European war. So the Espionage Act, which has been lying around for use against critics of the government since the time of Woodrow Wilson, was used more by the Obama administration than any administration in history. And now the Trump administration has followed up on that with this prosecution against this woman with the unlikely name of Reality Winner, and sent her off to jail for 5 years as a result of this blunder, we have to assume it is, by The Intercept. It's not the sort of mistake that whistleblowers should be making, but the fact of the matter is the situation shouldn't arise in the first place. That is, the information that was made available to the U.S., to the U.S. public, should have been available anyhow, and it shouldn't have required a whistleblower to talk about what the government knows on these matters. The attempt to suppress information about the U.S. government activities extends from WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, unjustly imprisoned for years in London, to Reality Winner and her 5 years in jail upcoming. It's a shocking situation, and it once again has the full force and credit, so to speak, of the U.S. government behind it in both recent administrations. This isn't anything new, unfortunately, but it does indeed seem to be growing. We should be writing our congressional representatives and complaining about the persecution of people like Reality Winner.
Yeah, but probably wasting your time writing Dick Durbin, right? So,
Well,
but
very good
anyway,
point.
yeah. But
The other thing to do is to drive Dick Durbin from office, but we won't have a chance to do that right away.
this year.
Yeah.
There was a nice interview with an ex-Marine named Matthew Ho, H-O-H, on the podcast Unauthorized Disclosure, which is hosted by Rania Kalik and Kevin Gostola. A nice hour-long interview, in case you're interested in the thought processes of a military guy who genuinely comes to understand what's going on, and then turns against it, and really continues to understand and process what's going on in the world in a pretty valid way, and who represents a group of people that aren't as who are there and share his beliefs, but are not as nearly outspoken about it as he is. I found it a very informative hour-long interview.
You've been watching News from Neptune for the 26th week of 2018, presented by Carl Estabrook and David Green, produced and directed by Jason Liggett, Ethan Young, and Andrew Scollery. This has been a homelessness edition. Our thanks to Research Director Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, the third man on News from Neptune. No's notes are posted on the Facebook page for News from Neptune. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies and a good night to you.